Tonight, I'm proud to introduce Peter Edelman, the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law and Public Policy and the Faculty Director of the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown University Law Center. He is also the writer of So Rich, So Poor, Why It's So Hard to End Poverty in America, and was once a top advisor for Robert Kennedy and for the Clinton administration. His new book is Not a Crime to Be Poor, The Criminalization of Poverty in America. In the book, he discusses the ongoing criminalization of poverty in the country's justice system, shedding light into how there is a great difference between how the legal system treats those with money and how it treats those that are without. Kirkus Reviews calls it an impassioned call for an overarching movement for justice. And Stephen Bright, president of the Southern Center for Human Rights, says that the book is a comprehensive, readable, and shocking examination of the criminalization of poverty and punishments that consist of fines and fees the poor cannot afford and conditions they cannot meet. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Edelman.
Whoa, wow. Well, thank you, Politics and Prose, and thank you all for coming. I see lots of friends and new friends, but lots of friends going back a very long time, and a few very special people here who helped me a lot on this book, and so Ben Shaw, wherever you are, and others who are here. I've worked on poverty issues for many years, but this book covers materials that are really largely new to me. What opened my eyes, like with many of you, beyond the killing of Michael Brown, was a city that was abusing its own citizens with unbelievably exorbitant fines and fees for made-up crimes and sending them to jail when they could not pay. And looking further, as I began learning more, I found that this abuse is widespread in our country. 21st century debtors' prisons and then some. So that's why I wrote this book. We go into municipal courtrooms any morning in New Orleans or St. Louis or a lot of places in this country, and you'll see the same thing. Men, or nearly all African-American men in orange jumpsuits. And they're among the thousands of people who are being held in jail for one reason only. They're poor. Inability to afford bail, sky-high fines and fees, and crashing debt from constantly escalating payment plans that make a vicious circle of repeated incarceration that goes on and on. In many states, the trap is repeated driver's license suspensions. People need to use their cars, so more convictions ensue, and the debts pile up. Jail may not occur, but garnishing wages and seizing tax refunds creates a different kind of jail. Well, why did this happen? In 2 words, Grover Norquist. The anti-tax revolution, abetted by the already operative mass incarceration. Starved for revenues, states and local governments turned to shaking people down, especially low-income people of color. They jacked up fines and added mountainous fees that had no connection with the violation. For example, a $500 fee toward the cost of running the courthouse gym in one county in Michigan. They made up offenses too. Unmowed grass and weeds, or drinking a beer on the front porch. The broken window policing brought in even more cash in many places. Money bail that people can't afford to pay means they're held until they plead guilty and are stuck with debt that will chase them endlessly, sometimes forever. People are put on bogus probation for $40 a month to be paid to for-profit companies in 13 states, but also to many public probation agencies as well. Juveniles are hit too. Besides going after adult defendants, young people and their families are hit for diversion programs and drug tests required where there's no history of drug abuse, and much more. Room and board are charged for people who are held in many jurisdictions, for both adults and young people. Well, now I can pay. We can pay. We can get a lawyer if we need one. For us, it's annoying. For low-income people, it's devastating. There's four forces that have coalesced here. And it's important to understand this, that all of them work together. The high fines and fees themselves, the phenomenal number of arrests, money bail to squeeze people to plead guilty, and the lack of lawyers. An NPR study found that 43 states charge a fee for a public defender. It seems like that's impossible, but it exists. The whole system is truly modern peonage, a government-operated loan shark business. It's big business. 10 million people in the country owe $50 billion in court debt from fines and fees. 66% of all current and former inmates owe unpaid fines and fees, including fees for their stay in prison. Community policing has turned into community policing. It calls up memories of the sharecropper economy that held families in financial servitude, always ending the year owing the plantation more than they had earned from the cotton crop, and therefore obligated to continue for another season. That's not all. And the book goes much more beyond. The criminalization of poverty metastasized. It spread to sending school children to court for minor things that used to be handled in the principal's office, to police-ordered evictions of women who call 911 to get protection against domestic violence and end up being evicted, to fraud charges against public benefit recipients, to vigorous prosecution of vagrancy laws against the homeless, and to public housing rules that bar ex-offenders. And it is as much about race as it is about poverty. I always say that the intersection of race and poverty is the most dangerous place in town. But there are people fighting back, and that's so important. Vera Cheeks from Bainbridge, Georgia, would have been sent to jail for rolling through a stop sign or faced with ever-mounting debt because she could not keep up on a payment plan, except she found Sarah Garrity of the Southern Center for Human Rights. Natasha Edet in New Orleans had no criminal record, but she was jailed because she could not make bail for a misdemeanor charge of simple battery. Fortunately, Jack Muse of Orleans Defenders got her out on her own recognizance. 11.7 million people are jailed every year. 11.7 million, 700,000 on any given day. 3/5 of them have not been found guilty of anything except being unable to afford bail. And Ms. Edet would have been one of them for much longer if she had not had a lawyer. Frederick Jefferson lost his driver's license and his job as a heavy equipment mechanic in Los Angeles. His ever-increasing debt hit $5,000 and he became homeless. 4 million people in California lost their licenses, 1 out of every 6 adults. And those numbers go through Texas and North Carolina and Virginia and Florida. Californians alone owed $10 billion. Driver's license suspensions, often for things unrelated to driving, are actually the majority of the outsized fines and fees nationally. California is working its back to sanity. Jefferson got his license back through reform legislation led by a number of people in the legislature and outside. We've also I found out recently, that we have driver's license suspensions here in the district automatically without asking whether people to pay. And people are now working on that. Darren Rainey, a Florida prison inmate with mental illness, was killed by correctional officers who rigged up a shower with scalding hot water and left him to burn to death. Jails and prisons are mental hospitals of the 21st century. 1 out of 7 inmates has serious mental illness. Nearly 40% of New York City's Rikers jails inmates have been diagnosed with mental illness. We might never have known about this except for the dogged investigation by Julie Brown of the Miami Herald. Jaden A., a high school junior in Antioch, California, was sent to court because a teacher said she elbowed him after she was attacked by other girls in the hall before school started. Luckily, her mother found Annie Lee, then a lawyer at the National Center for Youth Law. Lee represented her through the ordeal, ultimately getting the charges expunged. Important, because otherwise there would have been collateral consequences. The spurt in sending children to court occurred after Columbine, when the federal government spent $750 million to add 6,500 school resource officers in 3,000 schools around the country. And in 2011 to 12, 260,000 students were arrested in school or referred to law enforcement and sent to court. And in Texas and Wyoming, they are sent to adult court. Letitia Briggs, a certified nurse assistant in Norristown, Pennsylvania, did not call 911 because her former boyfriend got out of job after an earlier attack, and she was told by the police that she would be evicted if she called again. She nearly died. The police had the power because of a local property nuisance ordinance. We only know about it because she went to a local legal aid lawyer who in turn connected her to Sandra Park of the ACLU, which resulted in a $500,000 settlement with the city and repealing its ordinance and a statewide reform of its law. There are an estimated 10,000 such ordinances in the country, including one in each of the biggest 20 cities. The newest atrocity is Maplewood, Missouri, which is in St. Louis County, where if a woman tenant calls the police too often, they can ban her from living in the town at all for 6 months. I kid you not. 2 lawsuits are pending, one by our friend John Relman of the Relman Law Firm, and the other by the ACLUs. So every one of these, you get my gist. There are people who are pushing back in these horrible situations. Russell Bartholow lived for 15 years under a bridge in Sacramento, California. Native American, he had sustained a brain injury in a racially motivated attack when he was young. He had married, but his mental health deteriorated, and after his adopted mother died, he ended up under a bridge. In the 15 years that he lived under that bridge, he was arrested 190 times, spent 104 days in jail, and was assessed $104,000 in fines. In his case, his own sister found him, and she was working at the Western Center for Law and Policy, as it happened, and therefore was able to bring him back and have at least a decent life for the rest of his time. The criminalization of homelessness is worsening. Over the last decade, 60 citywide bans on camping in public space have increased by 69%, on loitering, loafing, and vagrancy by 88%, on living in vehicles 143%. The message to the homeless people in your city, or at least many cities, go away. That's what all that means. Now, that said, we know how to end homelessness. We have housing first, supported housing. And that has stabilized life for thousands who thought they would be homeless for the rest of their lives. We need to invest. The rest of the book is different. Not people who were criminalized. It's about people who've benefited from the positive. Public health people would call it primary prevention, child development, family support, community building. You see what I mean? And all of them, and I went to 7 of them around the country to see for myself, all of them operate at scale and improved lives by the thousands. This is the real decarceration. Jenna Searing is a Head Start parent in Cap, Tulsa, which is a lot more than Head Start. Stephen Dow and Cap, Tulsa are a national leader in two Gen, as they're called, programs. She says it changed her life. And having graduated from Cap Tulsa's Career Advance program, she has a great job doing billing for pediatric therapy. Monica Espinoza is an organizer and legislative advocate at the Logan Square Neighborhood Association in Chicago. Starting as a 17-year-old immigrant, she joined LISNA's signature parent mentor program and now lobbies in the state capitol for funds for the parent mentor program. Kimberly Streeter came to the New Haven Moms Partnership as a participant in the stress management class that is the hallmark of the organization, and now is a community mental health ambassador in the program. Dave B. lived under a bridge for 9 years like Russell Bartholow, but unlike Bartholow's story, he now lives in the Harrison Hotel run by the Trust Clinic in downtown Oakland, a result of funding primarily from the federally funded community health centers that began in 1964 with the War on Poverty. These stories exemplify our goal to end poverty. Of course, we surely need lawyers to defend individuals from the fines and fees, both public defenders and legal aid lawyers, and we need structural litigation, reforms in court administration, legislation to clean up fines and fees and reform money bail, and decarceration itself. Work to be done not only by lawyers, court leaders, public officials, and journalists, but also by the public generally. But bottom line, we need to invest in children and families and communities. We're moving forward on many fronts. Thomas Harvey of Arch City Defenders and Alec Karakatsanis of Civil Rights Corps obtained a $4.75 million settlement for almost 2,000 people in Jennings, Missouri, that's right next to Ferguson, who had been injured by fines and fees. Vanessa Hernandez and Nusrat Chaudhary of the ACLU and a pro bono firm rescued Jane Fuentes from unconstitutional treatment in Benton County, Washington, and ended the county's debtor prison system as well, state of Washington. Alec Karakatsanis and partners achieved an enormous victory in a 193-page opinion holding essentially that the money bail system in Harris County, Texas, that's Houston, which includes Houston, is unconstitutional. And it's now, it's a preliminary injunction, and it's now in the appellate court. Sandra Park of the ACLU and others have caused changes in the chronic nuisance ordinances that have victimized women punished for calling 911 for help from violence. People are fighting back. State judicial leaders and public officials have taken a strong stance against high fines and fees, including in the juvenile justice system. And I will say that as little as 10 years ago, the judges around the country, that the judicial systems around the country were happy to take in the money. And that has changed, and it's changed for the good, and that's very important. Policy reform on bail is moving along with legislative change and litigation in a number of states. Lenore Anderson and Proposition 47 in California have started momentum toward decarceration around the country. The federal momentum during the Obama administration is stalled now, but the work in the states and in localities continues, and it is gaining strength, and that is vital. But we need to understand that we will not have maximum effect in decarceration and move toward ending poverty if we don't create a movement that demands not only reform in policy, but more broadly, political change that puts into office people who will change our nation's direction as a whole. The real solution to injustice lies in ending poverty. And as Brian Stevens says, the opposite of poverty is justice. And as I always close any talk I make, I refer to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he said, he wrote a lot of big books, but maybe he was ahead of that little machine, you know, that the president uses. That's the one. And he said, we are not all guilty, but we are all responsible. Thanks so much. I did too.
I know, I was there when you worked there, and I was there after you left. But as you know, welfare reform, during the time of welfare reform in 1996, I at the time was working in the Federal Office of Child Support, which legislatively there were a lot of enforcement tools that were added.
Yes.
And if there is any federal program that needs to be looked at in terms of those policies, you know, in child support enforcement, the extreme is non-payment is incarceration.
Right.
And you talked about, and then of course the interest in arrears, the denial of your passport, revocation of a driver's license. To what extent in your book did you take a look at some of those federal programs?
Well, there's a chapter in the book about child support.
Oh, okay.
And many of you know that Vicki Turetsky, who was the head of it over the 8 years, did a lot of terrific work and got through a new regulation. And so I think there's some improvements. But it is still the case that there are places, about 11 states as I recall, that will put people in jail for not paying the child support when they themselves cannot pay the child support. I mean, we all want to use whatever mechanisms for people who have the money to pay and don't. That's very clear. But there are so many, there are those states still left that actually do what amounts to the debtor's prison.
And what's amazing is I don't think the federal policy has kept abreast of the changing demographics and the changing caseload of child support, which is now comprised of primarily single parents, low income.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peter, I wanted to highlight one I used to work, as you know, with the National Association of Counties, and one county that we were very proud of was Multnomah County, Oregon, Portland, Oregon.
Yep.
And they had a reception center where the policeman would have the judgment as to whether a child was dangerous or not. And if the policeman felt the child wasn't dangerous, he would refer the child to a reception center where they had a multidisciplinary board that would evaluate the child, a psychiatrist, psychologist, and then just defer them back to the parents or back to the community and not to the jail or to the detention center. And they cut detention almost immediately by a couple of thousand kids. They also looked at every department in the county to see what were they doing for early childhood development. Another point that you bring out, that we need to focus on primary prevention. I know when you left HEW, you were concerned with the welfare program and whether forcing mothers with young babies back into the workforce made any sense. But you might want to comment on that. But it seems to me that the other final point is that we need lawyers to make sure that the prosecutor doesn't run the show when they demand these high bail amounts. The judge often knows the prosecutor. They see each other every day, but they frequently don't know the public defender. So it's important that, but at the same time, there are about 2,400 counties that are rural counties. They don't have the tax base to hire a full-time public defender like in your state of Minnesota. 3 counties, Olmsted, which is an urban county, the home of the Mayo Clinic, Fillmore and Dodge counties, which are 2 rural counties, they have 1 attorney who has his own office, his own investigators, and they ride circuit. Now, the Gideon case called on the state to provide public defense or indigent defense. But many states are passing it on to rural jurisdictions that don't have the resources.
Yep. Well, thank you for all that. All very important. And you know, as to the question of detention, it's like many things that people are doing the right job, as you're saying about Multnomah County, and you know, the question is how to propagate that, how to get it done other places. When I was the commissioner of youth corrections in New York, we did that kind of a change with detention policies. I think I'll take a pass on welfare if anybody doesn't mind. It takes a long time when you get me started there. And of course, about public defenders, it's such a sad and difficult thing that Gideon is so hollow in too many parts of our country.
Peter. You. Hi. First, I want to thank you for shining this very harsh light on the bail outrages. I think it's a public service. I was glad to hear of some of these huge settlements, but I wonder, is there is there not some way to craft a case that would get up to the Supreme Court that would end this practice? I don't know.
Which practice? Done with bail?
The bail.
Well, it's on its way.
Adding bail and fees and bail and fees and bail.
Well,
and
they're
fees.
different from each other. Bail is possible to have to challenge a whole system, and that's what's happened in Houston. And in fact, there's litigation in Cook County, Illinois, in San Francisco, in Massachusetts. There are a number of cases that are cooking on the Constitution.
I meant instead of just doing it piecemeal, isn't there some way to craft a case that would make it up through the courts to the Supreme Court instead of doing it in Houston and,
but
and
you see,
various
these
counties?
These are all state statutes.
Yeah, but
state systems.
can't
Now,
they be
you
declared
might
unconstitutional?
we should live so long, but you could
Right.
we might get enough wins at the local level so that other states sort of fall into place. But let's be a little careful about the Supreme Court.
Point well taken.
Very, very seriously, I think what has more, this is hard work. And the real way of, the better way, the litigation is very, very important, is to get the states to pass legislation that reforms their own bail system. And that's happening in a considerable number of states already. New Jersey with Governor Christie. Maryland just this past year. Kentucky a while ago. D.C., by decades, in fact, we were the leaders in the country. So those things stick when you do them, because you have a new statute, a new system in place, and that's what we really want. Fines and fees are more complicated. I see my dear friend Lisa out there. We're talking about how to get a more systematic approach to the fines and fees, because they tend to be very local. And you knock out maybe a county. And there we've seen some legislation in some of the states. Texas is beginning to move on that with Chief Justice Heck down there, a very interesting person, probably doesn't agree with me about anything except this. Those things are beginning to happen, but we really need a systematic way. It's not quite the idea of litigating in a more systematic way on the fines and fees is a little bit harder.
First, I'd like to, it's working. I'd like to thank both you and your wife for a lifetime of incredible justice work.
She's right there.
I know. It's really the energy the two of you have put into these issues is breathtaking. I feel that the more I think about what you're saying and where I come from, that these are circular issues that all kind of depend on each other. And I feel close to some of what you're saying because I worked as a caseworker, a welfare caseworker in Pennsylvania for 9 years, and I worked in 2 state hospitals and as a supervisor of court-committed men who were murderers and rapists, et cetera. So I feel like I know that population. The emphasis lately in these days is on upcoming elections and electing better people with our collective values that are in this room. And the voter suppression and the laws in 30-plus states have been horrendous. And as a professor, and all the tricks that they've played, I'm right now most worried about that and those laws. And aside from giving lots of money, more money to the ACLU, I'm not sure how we can change this for the next election.
Well, it's not my subject this evening, but it's vital. And I can tell you that we have related to my law school at Georgetown a campaign finance institute that's working on suppression as well. So we're doing certainly what we can, but particularly, I mean, ultimately, it is, you said circular, because we need to change laws. You know, first of all, the Supreme Court did a very bad thing in the, I can't remember the name, but it's an Indiana case. And so it's now constitutional for them to do these things when it really isn't. But again, these things we have to take all the measures and from all directions that we can, and it's both about organizing politically as well as wherever we can litigate. So all of that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, if I can just very quickly just add that when you talked about the driver's license being confiscated, that reminded me of, again, another way that they can suppress.
Yes.
And just today there was, I think I may have seen it on HuffPost or somewhere, but there's a woman who was denied access to her infant for something like 9 or 10 months because she owed a court fine.
Yeah.
And this child, it was taken at 4 months, and she didn't have
Yes.
access to her own baby.
Well, it's just astonishing and very sad, all of
Thank you.
these things that take place, and I'm able to lift up some of them and talk about them, and talk about not only what we should be doing about them, but in many of these things where people are, which I think is very, very important. I guess, sir? Yes.
Good evening.
Hi.
I met you downstairs.
Yes.
I was just passing by, and
Yeah.
it's out of your book.
That was a great visit, yeah.
But during your introduction, it was almost appropriate that tonight's Halloween, and all this information
Yeah, I
was
meant
frightful.
to say a
Okay.
word,
But,
eluded me, yeah.
you know, when I hear these types of, because I heard about these statistics
Yeah.
a couple years ago when they first started and how they were ballooning.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't familiar with debtor's prison except through Charles Dickens' readings,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and Slavery by Another Name more recent, and now this. So when you say the vast majority of the victims are African Americans, you get why NFL players are protesting.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not that we're not patriots.
Yes. Yeah.
We have to make a statement somewhere somehow, because if you are, shining a light on it, and politics and prose can go a long way, but when you have the NFL, you're protesting. These are the type of undercurrents that help drive the book.
Yeah.
But I wanted you to talk about, what do you think when President Obama and Eric Holder stopped these contracted prisons, and they were saying that we really didn't need them because they're not making the type of money or whatever purpose they were created for, that they decided to stop the financing of it. And then when the new Attorney General, the current one, said that he's going to relook and reinstate these contracted prisons, does that play a role or an extension of what you just
Yes.
shared with us?
Yeah.
And how?
Well, the for-profit, it is just all through the criminal justice system. I always say criminal justice system, and that's something in my head goes off. And when of course a lot of us at the state level, and those things have to be dealt with state by state. But there was a sense during the Obama administration that we were finally kind of pushing back and beginning to shrink that. And one of the things that we see is that every other thing that you can think of, every test that might be like a drug test or an alcohol test or wearing an ankle thing when you're out on probation or something like that, place after place, it's all proprietary. It's all profit-making companies. that are getting the contracts, so that it's doesn't tell near the totality of the story of the prisons themselves. I mean, that's bad enough and maybe the center of what's terrible, but you now have, we now have, or they now have, these kinds of fees associated with everything that you can think of. Some of them is to make money for the state or the municipality, but in a lot of cases, it's to they let the for-profit company do it, and then the state gets a cut of it. So it's really omnipresent. And the answer is we've got to lift it up. It's nothing you can sue about, and I mean you can sue if they hurt somebody. Although even that's kind of complicated because of sovereign immunity and so on. But it's really about a much bigger consciousness about it, and for people to be pushing back to stop it in a legislative way. We're not there yet.
Hi. Thank you for everything that you've said today. But it was touched on earlier about how with juvenile justice, the propensity to reoffend has a very large impact in the type of sentencing they receive.
What does?
The propensity to reoffend, or likelihood that they will reoffend.
Oh, yeah.
And it just seems to me that it creates this kind of catch-22 where the people or the children who are most in need of compassionate services are then the least likely to get them. And I understand the need to prevent those people from reoffending, but how do we reconcile that with where these are the kids who are most likely to grow up to be more aggressive criminals, and that if we could stop it earlier and give them more attentiveness and more services, then that we could save ourselves from a lot of trouble down the road. And so how do we reconcile those two problems where they're getting the least services when they're the ones who could probably benefit the most from good services?
Well, I think you should go to work for my wife at the Children's Defense Fund.
I would like that.
We could start with that. I mean, you're really, of course, you know that the answer to your question is really starts with birth, or pregnancy, and we just need to. It's the support of the families and the children. It's about income for the families, jobs, because that makes a huge difference for the children coming up. So it's not just talking about Head Start and 0 to 5 and all of that, which is vital, and we know so much now, more than we did, about the efficacy of it, and then then on up, so that living in a healthy community, everything about talking about stopping crime is as a positive matter. Turn the coin over. And the conversation is about development. It's about the positive things that make it so that people don't think about, just crime isn't something that's in their lives. That's really what I was saying here. That the bottom line of what I'm saying is we need to do everything that I said in terms of fines and fees and the bail and all that stuff, and the decarceration, which is of course a very big effort, but really it's got just what you said. It's got to back up into everything about life. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I don't expect you to. I just want your views on the fact that we're afraid of homeless people, poor people, dark people. The context is I'm a tennis coach in the center city, so on 8 tennis courts we'll have people who have jobs and who are working and having fun. But outside the fence there will be people who just present themselves as looking like they don't have resources at all. Sometimes they just want to watch, sometimes they just want to talk. But I noticed that my players, they get a real edge, and it's like they want to punish people for being poor and not. How do we fix that? We're afraid of poor people. We're afraid of, and I just want your views on that.
Yes. Well, you're talking, as you know, about something in our human condition that goes back probably to biblical time and to Elizabethan England. You know, we've always talked about deserving and undeserving, even among those who are poor. So these attitudes, assumptions, fears that people have, that's not a new thing. It's not helpful to have what we have right now in terms of how making our country more divisive. And when we talk about homelessness, it's the sadness of it is that so much of it doesn't have to be. You know, we really basically stopped investing in help with mental health. We closed the state hospitals back in the day, and the promise was that we would have community-based services that would meet people's needs in a decent way, and we don't do that. And so many, not at all, but so many people who are homeless also have issues on public health. And then I did mention, and it's we have Pathways DC here that you may know about, some people probably do, which is our local version of Housing First. And they have built, in a lot of, by the way, a lot of private money in it as well, people supporting it. And, you know, this was such an important insight that sort of was right in front of you. For years, they would say to a homeless person, you clean yourself up and then we'll find you the housing. And this says, we'll put you in the housing, and guess what? Life's going to be better for you, and a lot of those problems that they have just simply go away, or there's support there for them, and they get help along with. So many things that we have, we know what to do. There's a lot we don't, and we don't invest. Now, if it is going back to one of the earlier questions, a little bit circular. Because you have to break in and have essentially have leadership. It's a difference. You know, just talking about homelessness, Utah, Salt Lake City, is the best place in the country for Housing First. They've shown everybody that you can do that, and you just have to get it to catch in other places. So that's only a partial answer. And the deeper answer of how we get people who just have these prejudices about anybody who's poor must be faulty, you know, they must be lazy, they must be all kinds of bad things. And that's tough. But thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
You pointed a finger at Grover Norquist.
Yeah.
I wonder if you care to lob a few actual sharp rocks his way.
Well,
Expound a
I've
little
got-
bit.
I mean, right at the moment, we actually have something nice to say about him. I mean, it's hurting me. But as you probably know, in the current effort to decarcerate, he's been very, very involved in a positive way. And when I put that little hit at him, little zing at him in my remarks, I was thinking about, should I be fully honest here? Well, you know. But in fact, you know, the people that mostly we don't like, the Koch brothers and others like that, I don't particularly like their motives and, you know, why they're doing it, but that's okay. We can deal across the aisle and do it for different reasons. And I've seen things that he's written. Some of you in the room who work on that are quite aware of all of this. And so we do have to give him credit there.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the Ban the Box movement. It's about not having to put down you had a criminal record or arrest, I think. And
Yeah.
if someone gets out of jail and wants to be a good citizen and work, he can't get a job, so the cycle repeats. And I also wonder, I hope this isn't inappropriate, if you could talk a minute about your time with Robert Kennedy.
Sure. Well, that takes a long time, but I'll say.
Well, I was hoping it would.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have a drink afterwards. On Ban the Box, I think it's very partial. I think it's sort of been oversold as a major thing. It actually, some critics say that it actually makes things worse, because then there's an assumption about everybody who comes in must have been an offender, and they don't differentiate. Without sort of resolving that question, I think we really, for one thing, what we have to be doing is to get rid. The story that I told about Jaden A., the young woman in the school, and getting her charges expunged. That's much more powerful. It's not simple to do.
If you expunge them, though, you still have to say, yes, were you ever arrested? Don't you?
No.
No?
It's fully expunged. No. That's part of the expungement. I mean, it depends what the particular state does. It could be done in some part, and tends to be for more minor offenses. And besides, this isn't one thing, but anybody who's carrying, ban the box is one thing that relates to employment. That's, if it helps, fine. People shouldn't be carrying that around at all. People are working. My friend Sharon Dietrich with Community Legal Services in Pennsylvania, they're really working with people around the country to get expungement accepted in more places, and cutting across more offenders. And then, beyond that, we should be talking about decarceration. We should be talking about simplification. We've got so many laws that we don't need, junky little laws that they've done to take in money. That's what I'm, we've got crime after crime where the sentences are just not, they don't fit with the offense, so if you're really going to, in a fair way, in a way that protects the community, we've got a long way to go, and I worry about things like ban the box if people think that that's somehow the magic solution.
It's a start.
It's a start, but let's be clear that it's not the end. Robert Kennedy, what can I say? I mean, we miss him. I had a wonderful, personally, to be associated with him and his commitment on the very things that we're talking about. On bail, for example, when he was Attorney General, before I met him, he was involved in creating the Vera Institute in New York, and they were the original reformers on bail. And we lost it along the way because there was some of the public fear of crime, and bondsmen have acquired major political power, and actually insurance companies too, to buy the bonds, and so we sort of lost our way in that. But that starts with Robert Kennedy, and there's so many things that we did that I had the privilege to be involved in, that it's a legacy that I treasure. So thank you.
Imagine what a different country we'd be.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.